this is my little preface at the beginning. Before you get too carried away taking notes, all these PowerPoints are on my website. If you go to Bush Farms, go to Beekeeping, go down the left-hand side to presentations, you'll find them all listed. So you can download this later and look at it, assuming you have anything that'll read a PowerPoint presentation. I have a book for sale back here. Some of you have already bought it, but I probably should point out, basically, it's just my website turned into a book. So you can read it for free. You don't have to buy it to read it, but if you want a book, I have books back here. I often have people asking about ebooks. I don't sell these on Amazon because they want 40% when they sell an ebook, and they never even have to touch a product. And they only get 20% when they sell one of my books. So I think it's unfair, so I don't sell them on Amazon, but you can buy them on my website if you want to go buy an ebook. I never figure out why people want to do that when you can read it online for free. It's kind of, but whatever. That's your choice. I guess you don't have to have an internet connection to read it if you have the ebook. But I have a bee camp. I'm having I think it's the 4th one this year at my house. I'm kind of sold out for spring. I could get one person in just because somebody canceled at the last minute. And it's not like I have a specific number of spots, but I'm trying to keep the number at around 25 because that's about how many people I can get around a beehive and talk about what's going on, and everybody can still see what's going on. If I get 50 people, then it's, nobody can see what we're doing. So I've kind of limited it to 25, and I think I'm one short of that right now because somebody canceled. But anyway, I call it my Tom Sawyer Bee Camp. I want you to come to my house, do all my work for me, and pay me $100 a day. So if that's interesting to you, you can check that out. I'm contemplating a fall bee camp. I'm taking names and making a list right now to see if I have enough interest in a fall camp to do this again in the fall. Obviously, there's more interesting things, I think, to do in the spring, but there are things that you need to learn about getting bees through the winter that you might get out of the fall one. Because basically the spring camp, I'm doing my spring stuff, and we're raising queens, and we're doing splits, and we're checking the hives and things I would be doing in the spring. So the fall one, we could be doing the things that we'd be doing in the fall. We can harvest some honey, we can, settle them down for the winter, make sure they got enough food, those kinds of things. We go through all that. So if you're interested, that's on you can read more about it on my website. This is one of my favorite quotes from the Tao Te Ching. The master accomplishes more and more by doing less and less until finally he accomplishes everything by doing nothing. The concept of the Tao is that there's a flow to the universe, and if you get in that flow, things go really well. And if you get out of that flow, then you're just fighting the universe, and it never seems to work out well. So finding that place where you're in the flow is the goal. Now, I don't think we ever get to the point where we accomplish everything by doing nothing, but that's the goal, to get in the flow so much that things just fall into place. Everything works if you let it, is a line by Art Carney in the movie Roadie. It's actually not a line, it's actually the sign over the fix-it shop they run. And I remember the first time I saw it, it really kind of made me mad because I worked very hard at making things work, and the idea that you could just let them work really kind of irritated me. But the older I got, the more I realized there's an awful lot of truth to that. There's an awful lot of truth to getting in the flow of things and letting them work instead of fighting them. So I'm going to talk about some of the things I've changed just to make that ended up making my life easier. Some of them, that wasn't my original intent. In this case, top entrances, my original intent was to try to solve my skunk problem. I'll tell you this story just because it kind of illustrates that everything is a system, and that one thing in the system can disrupt other things in the system. I had been keeping bees for decades, and I'd always had them on a stand quite a ways off the ground, and that hadn't worked too badly when I lived in town and where the wind isn't so bad, and I've got a lot of trees around me and houses around me. But I moved out in the country, and my hives, well, it happened to coincide with a bumper crop year, and I was stacking supers on with a step ladder, and then we got a sheer wind that came in and blew all my hives over. So I decided I wanted to move them closer to the ground so they wouldn't blow over so easy. And so I didn't have to put the supers on with a step ladder. And of course, I usually mention this, it's not getting them on with a step ladder that's the hard part. It's getting them off. When they're empty, they aren't too bad. But when they're full, there's no, if the ladder's behind you and you're facing this way, you're going to fall off the ladder. And if the ladder's in front of you, there's nowhere to put the box because the ladder's in front of you. So it's not, you end up holding low over your head with the honey dripping on you. Not fun. But anyway, so I moved it down, and then the skunks became a problem. And it took me a while to figure it out. My hives were just not thriving, and I was trying to figure out, well, why, they should really be taken off, and they didn't seem to be really taken off. So I went out and I'm looking at them, trying to figure out what's going on, and I find these little soggy piles of bees in front of my entrances. While the skunks, they scratch on the entrance and get the bee to come out, and they catch it in their paws, and they roll it in the grass and get it to sting the grass. And then they pop it in their mouth, and they keep doing that till they have a mouthful. They suck all the juice out, and then they spit them out. Judging by the scat there, I think occasionally they accidentally swallow them because there's usually some scat that's obvious went through the other end, but usually they just spit them back out. So I sat out there all night and shot a skunk and thought I solved my problem, but next weekend I was out there looking at my bees and there were still little soggy piles of bees. That's when I realized there's an entire family of skunks out there, not just a skunk. Anyway, I went to top entrances because top entrances solve the problem because for the same reason that a hive solves the problem, that if a skunk has to get up like this, then they get stung right here, and this is really sensitive here, where this is really thick leather, really thick skin on the back of their neck. It's really thin skin right here on their throat, just like it is on you. So they don't like getting stung. So I went to the top entrances. That was my skunk solution. There are other skunk solutions, and they all involve interfering with that rolling it in the grass part. If you put a paving stone in front of there, then they got no grass to roll them in. If you put chicken wire in front of them, then their claws catch on the chicken wire when they're trying to roll it in the grass, and they don't like that. And some people put carpet strips there, and they think it's stopping them because the skunks are stepping on them. Well, the skunks are smart enough to step over them, but they still have the problem of they need to do this little motion of trying to get them to sting the grass, and they're always running into your carpet strips. So all of those work, but anyway, this is what I did. And I didn't anticipate all the other advantages. But one of the things I didn't have to do was cut the grass in front of the hives, which I usually didn't do anyway, but I'd be out there pulling the grass in front of the hives so they can get out the entrance sometimes. After I went to top entrances, that was never an issue. By the time the hive is this tall, by the time the grass is this tall, the hive's this tall. By the time the grass, the grass doesn't get any taller than that where I am, so I'm already up to here, so it's no big problem. So I don't have to cut the grass in front of it to keep it open. It's true, sometimes I go to work them and then the grass is, becomes an issue, but I can usually just do the grass dance thing. See, you just catch it with your foot and lay it down, catch it with your foot and lay it down, and mash all that grass down. Now I can work on the hive without the grass getting stuck in between my boxes when I put them back together. Yeah?
When you're saying you're not cutting grass around the hives, I take it there's no cattle or livestock trying to graze that could hit them with their heads or their...
No, they're all fenced off for my horses. So now my horses will reach under the fence and eat the grass right in front of the entrance, and every once in a while they get stung doing that, and then they run off, and then a few minutes later they're back to doing it again. But yeah, they can't get in there. Yeah, livestock, if they've got enough room, it's not really a problem that you have to fence them off. But if you have any kind of limited space, I would fence the bees off from livestock because they'll want to scratch on it, and then they knock it over, and then you got problems. Where I live, it's real likely I could get a foot of snow today, and it could be 70 degrees tomorrow. So my problem was when I had nothing but bottom entrances, they get all plugged up with the snow, and then some winters, that might be their only shot at a cleansing flight. Some winters, not. Some winters, they get lots of shots at a cleansing flight. I can remember one winter in the last 10 years where it never warmed up enough that the bees could fly from about November until May. But most winters it does several times during the course of the winter, but you never know. So I'm out there shoveling the snow to make sure on that, if it gets sunny and warm, they can take that cleansing flight. So I saved that. Mouse guards, that's always a dilemma with mouse guards. You put them on too soon or you put them on too late, or you forget to put them on, then you got, you either got mice getting in the hives, or you got mice you trapped in the hives because you put them on too late, or you put them on too early and they're still trying to get that last batch of pollen for that last batch of bees, and they're having to squeeze through this mouse guard to get in. It kind of slows things down. So once I went to top entrances, I didn't have to worry about that anymore. Skunks were
Mice can't climb?
they don't get in. I've never had them get in the hive with the top entrance, a live hive with the top entrance. Can they? Sure, I'm sure they can. Yeah. But they have to go in the hive through the cluster to get to the bottom, as opposed to go in the bottom, set up shop while bees are clustered, and then pick off a bee now and then. I've never had them get in with the top entrance. Do I think they can climb up there and get in? I'm sure they can. Yeah, they're pretty. Mice are pretty handy. Ventilation, I think, though, is part of the. Well, they're cheaper and easier to make. That's true. And there's the issue of, in the winter, sometimes the dead bees pile up to the point that they can't get out the entrance. I had a pesticide kill once where they were spraying the soybeans and they got my bees, and the dead bees piled up so much on the bottom board that the bees that were still alive in the hive couldn't get out because of all the dead bees blocking the entrance. So having a top entrance, that's never a problem, whether it's winter or whether it's a pesticide kill from the farmers. Either way, it never blocks, the entrance is never blocked. Of course, the whole object of the game in the first place was to move it down, but moving it down was what started off some of these problems. But the less condensation is, I think, the main issue, really. I think the main advantage to it is that the problem with ventilation that the bees face all year round is moisture. Moist air rises, and so they need to get rid of moisture, and moist air rises, then the way to get rid of it is to let it out the top, because that's where it goes to the top. In the summer, they're trying to evaporate nectar to make honey, they're trying to evaporate water to cool the hive, and that moist air needs to go somewhere so that they can evaporate more of it. And moist air rises. In the winter, they're eating honey and burning it, and their metabolism is creating carbon dioxide and water. And that water vapor that they're creating often causes condensation problems in the hive because it rises, and then the top is usually cold, and so it condenses on the top and drips on the bees. So if you let that moisture out the top, you've got less moisture problems. Because moist air rises. I know a lot of people think moist air settles, but if it did, then the clouds would all be on the ground instead of up there in the sky. So it's just not true. Yes?
What about really dry climates with 0% humidity? Don't you want some of that to stay in the hive?
You're still going to get it in the hive. It's still going to condense on the walls.
Yeah. Even with a big old top entrance.
Well, I don't run big old top entrances anymore. I reduce them all year round. I leave them about 1.5 inches wide all the time. I used to open them up in the summer and then close them down in the winter. Some of them I left wide open in the winter. All in all, it seemed like the ones that were reduced all the time did better than the ones that were wide open at any time. So that's kind of what I ended up doing. I got less problems with robbing that way, and I don't need a big entrance to let that moisture out. I just need to let some moisture out. So now, yeah, I don't run them wide open, but when I was in western Nebraska, condensation was never really an issue. I mean, I'm sure there was condensation, but I never got wet bees that died because they got wet.
Yeah, I've never seen
So you probably don't have that problem in Montana. You're probably about the same humidity, maybe even drier than western Nebraska. But in eastern Nebraska, the humidity is enough higher that we get condensation issues. And in Seattle or anywhere in Oregon or Washington on the coast, I bet they have major problems with condensation. Yeah.
Do you use screen bottom boards or have any kind of opening in the bottom for flow?
I try not to, but I probably do have air in the bottom for flow. I don't buy screen bottom boards anymore. I have some, I use them, I just leave the tray in all the time, and probably some air leaks around those. And the other solid bottom boards I turned into bottom board feeder just in case I need to feed. I don't have to buy feeders because I already have a bottom board. And they have a little screened area in the front, and I keep putting boards over that, but something knocks those off. I've never figured out if it's the mice or the raccoons or what, but they never seem to stay there. So quite often there is probably some air coming in the bottom, but I'm not trying to make any, and I think I'd be better off if there wasn't any air coming in the bottom. The bees
I live in a very high humidity area, so we need flow.
Okay, well, if you take a solid bottom board and just make a dam that blocks it entirely and drill a little 1/4-inch hole to let the water drain out, and then put screen wire over there. You'll have a nice bottom board feeder, and there'll be air coming in there. But just keep in mind, beekeeping is always a system. So my system doesn't involve using queen excluders. If it involved using queen excluders, I'd be facing the issue that if I put no bottom entrance and the brood nest is in the bottom, which is where it's always going to end up, and then I put a queen excluder on the top, all the drones are trapped. I have to let them out somewhere. So you need an 1/8 inch hole somewhere below that queen excluder for those drones to get out, or 3/8 inch hole. So if you either drill a hole, if you're damming up a solid bottom board with a 3/4 by 3/4 board and drill a 3/8 inch hole in there, then the drones can get out there. Now you may still have some issues with the skunks, but actually, as long as it's a really tiny entrance, it doesn't seem to attract the skunks so much as a wide open entrance down there. Yeah.
Is your entrance a hole in the box, or is it a spacer with a little rectangular?
Well, we'll look at it. Here's my. This is upside down here. It's a piece of plywood the size of the box, and this is a shingle shim on each side, glued and nailed on. And then you flip it over, and it makes an entrance there. And then what I've done now is, I don't have a picture on here, but I started using. You can cut the board, but I just buy some screen molding and put it in here. Screen molding is 3/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch, and I have it at my local hardware store. I can buy it on my way home from work, and put one nail in the middle here, and that blocks the entrance all but the last couple of inches. And so I reduce it. And I just leave it reduced all the time now. But if I want to open it, I can flip it open. On that pivot, that one nail, it'll pivot. I can pivot it open like this. Of course, then when they beard, they tend to hang on that sticking out there, which looks a little funny, but it doesn't hurt anything. But it is kind of funny to see that stick sticking out. It almost looks like a swarm hanging there because they're bearding, and instead of being on the front of the hive, they got something to hang on, and so they just start hanging on that.
So Michael, what about cleaning the hive out? Are they able to bring all their dead comrades up top?
Yeah, it doesn't make any difference. Some hives are going to keep it clean, and some hives aren't going to keep it clean, and that's true whether you got top entrances or bottom entrances. And at the end of winter, there's almost always a pile of dead bees on the bottom until they get enough bees going to clean it up. And usually by then, I've inspected the hives and just dumped off the dead bees anyway. So the accumulation over winter, you probably need to, dump the bottom board off, but the rest of the time they do fine. I've watched them in my observation hive, which has a bottom entrance, and the house bees hauling this dead body all over the hive. They don't seem to have any trouble hauling them all over the hive. They have trouble finding the entrance, but I think those house bees haven't figured out where the entrance is yet, but somehow they got assigned the job of hauling it out. I don't know if, you always wonder. Some other bees say, hey, take it outside. And they go, where's outside?
What's outside?
Get rid of it.
But I won't say there'll never be dead bees accumulate on the bottom, because when I had bottom entrances, some of them had dead bees accumulate on the bottom. So, but no more or less than when I had bottom entrances. I think this is a big time saver. If you get all the same size frames in your operation, it makes your life really simple. Because if you're getting ready for winter and here's your little cluster and you got this empty frame here and this empty frame here, you can grab a frame of honey and a frame of honey and put them here and here. And you don't have the problem of the honey's on a medium and your brood is on deeps, and now it doesn't quite fit. I'm dealing with this not fitting, or you're trying to do the pyramiding up that Dee's going to talk about here, and you're trying to pull some brood out to move them up to the next box and the next box and the next box. Well, that only really works if they're all the same size. It doesn't work very well when you have 2 deeps and some shallows, or some mediums, and you're trying to move them up. I'm trying to open up the brood nest to keep them from swarming, and I got to take some frames of brood out of here and move them somewhere. And if I can just move them up to the next box, it makes my life simple. If I can't, then it makes my life complicated. I got to figure out where to put these extra frames. So it really simplifies life when they're all the same size.
You do all 8 frame medium?
I do all 8 frame mediums, yeah. So then you can put any frame anywhere. The other thing is if you want to use a queen excluder, which I'm not recommending you do, but if you want to, especially new beekeepers, you're going to have to get them to go through the queen excluder. Put a couple of frames of brood on the other side of the queen excluder and they'll start going right through it. But if you got nothing but bare foundation on the other side of the queen excluder, they aren't real happy about going through it. Now, if you got drawn comb, they'll usually go through it to work drawn comb, but it just doesn't work very well using a queen excluder without baiting them through there with something. And if they're all the same size, it's easy to come up with that something, whether it's a couple of frames of brood from the brood box. If what's in the supers and what's in the brood box is the same, that's an easy thing to do. If not, it's a complicated thing to do. So I cut I used to have all deeps. I started for 20 some years, I ran deeps and shallows, and then I actually accidentally bought some mediums because I didn't realize there was a difference, because I'd just been, I bought some equipment and then I made a whole bunch of equipment, and then I kind of used that for decades, and then got back into beekeeping and wasn't paying that much attention and bought some mediums, and then I realized I got 3 different sizes now. So eventually I decided, I was going to just do all deeps, and my back protested, and so I stopped doing that. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But so anyway, I decided I was going to do all deeps first, and then eventually I decided I was going to do all mediums. So I cut all the deeps down to mediums. So this is the end of the bottom. This is the bottom end of the end bar, and this is the bottom bar, and that's the top bar. So I ran the frames through the table saw at 6 1/4 inches, and then ran the bottom bars through the table saw at 3/8 of an inch, and then just did a butt joint there, nailed it through here into here, and cut them all down. Now, I don't necessarily recommend you do all that if you're a hobbyist. Find somebody who wants to buy some bees and sell off the deep stuff. But if you got thousands of them like I did, and you're handy with a table saw, you can cut them all down. Lighter boxes. Friends don't let friends lift deeps. To me, the hardest thing about beekeeping physically is lifting boxes. And if I lift a deep box full of honey once, I hurt for a month. I can lift 8-frame mediums, never weigh more than they never weigh 50 pounds. They're 40 some, 48, 45, somewhere in that range if they're full, and they're less if they're not full. So I can lift those all day long, and at most my back has that ache that tells me I did some work at the end of the day, and I feel fine the next day. Yes, Dee?
As concerning lifting whole boxes, which a lot of people do, I was always told back in my 20s and 30s, it's fun to do that when you're younger, but as you get older, you'll regret it. And that's when you always learn to work with a bee brush, taking one frame at a time with a hand truck, so you could stack your boxes, remove the honey a frame at a time, get the boxes down to a weight you can lift, and then do it without acting stupid and busting your back.
And yes, you can move them a frame at a time, but when I go into a bee yard to split it, I'm splitting them by the box, and I can split a whole bee yard in about an hour. And if I was moving them a frame at a time, it would take me all day. So if I can't lift the boxes, I can't keep up with the amount of work I have to do.
See, as you're older doing it too, you've got all day to do it, so you're not home sleeping bored.
I've never had all day to do it. I've never been sitting home bored. I understand what you're saying. This is just a bar chart of the weight. This is an 8-frame medium, a 10-frame medium, and a 10-frame deep. If you want to get an idea, that's the difference. The other thing about a 10-frame deep, though, is you go out and pry a 10-frame deep loose on all 4 corners on a hot day, and then you go to pick it up, and you end up picking up that box and the box below it, even though you broke it loose, because as soon as it's got 90 pounds pushing back down on that propolis, and as soon as you stopped prying it up, it glued itself back down. So now you picked up 2 deep boxes, not one, before that one finally let go and fell that last 3 inches back down. That doesn't seem to happen on a 45-pound box. It's not pushing down on that propolis so much. You pry up 3 corners, 4 corners, pick it right up. And it doesn't glue itself back down because it doesn't have that 90 pounds pushing down on it. So that's my experience. So if you want to get a grasp of this, go to the hardware store and try and pick up 2 50-pound boxes of nails at the same time. That's what a full deep feels like. Or 2 50-pound bags of feed. Basically, an 8-frame medium full of honey is going to be about the same as one of those 50-pound bags of feed. I used to buy all my feed in 100-pound sacks so I could get the burlap, because I wanted it for my smoker, but I was a 20-year-old carpenter and I really didn't care that it weighed 100 pounds. I'd throw a 100-pound bag of feed on my shoulder and run off with it and not think twice about it. By the time you hit 40, that gets pretty hard to do, and by the time you hit 60, it's really hard to do. So, anyways, I can lift 50 pounds. I think 50 pounds is about what a human being should be lifting, but that's... So how do you change over? I know this is intuitively obvious, and I often get a laugh from this, but the reality is you need to stop buying what you don't want. I can't believe how many people make this more complicated than it is. They're like, well, I'm going to keep buying deeps until... Why? If you don't want deeps anymore, stop buying them. Now, stop buying them. If you don't want 10-frame boxes and you want 8-frame boxes, then start buying 8-frame boxes. It's not like it's going to make your life that complicated. You can cut a few adapters, and I'll show you a picture of them in a minute, and you can put the 8-frame boxes on top of 10-frame boxes. It's not a problem. And if you don't feel like cutting them down, which I'll show you some pictures of me cutting them down, but you can always, again, there's always people wanting to buy bees. Sell your bees off in the boxes you don't want, or use them for swarm traps or whatever. You can take a couple of mediums, or maybe even 3 mediums, and take a 1x down the corners and screw them into all 3 boxes and set that out there for your bait hive. You know, just put some frames in the top. If you catch it before they get the comb drawn down too far, you can take the frames out of the top, put them in something else. Or if you really want, you can fill the whole thing full of frames. I believe it. But there's ways to use the equipment you have. This is an 8-frame. These are 8-frame boxes. These are 10-frame boxes. Those are 8-frame boxes. This is a 1x3, 20 inches long. You just buy a 1x3. You can cut an 8-foot 1x3. You can cut what? Four of those. So you can cut 4 of those out of one. You got 4 adapters right there. Just throw that on the side. And I know everybody always says, "Well, isn't the rain going to go in here?" No, it's not. If you put that on in the morning, by that afternoon, they've got that glued. They got that crack glued shut. And by tomorrow, they've got it glued shut enough that when you pry it off, it'll string on a hot day. And on a cold day, it'll pop, because propolis is kind of, dependent on temperature. But they'll seal that right up. This is not something I invented. This is what Carl Killian was doing purposefully. He would have one 10-frame deep down here for his brood nest, and then he'd have 8-frame comb honey supers here, and he'd have that just to block that difference, because he wants to funnel these bees up and crowd them into those supers. So he did this all the time. This is a 10-frame box. I'm cutting them down to 13 3/4. You kind of need to decide what size you want to do. You could mix and match them a little bit, but for some reason nobody ever standardized this. Half the 8-frame boxes out there are 13 3/4. The other half are 14 inches. It doesn't matter. They both work fine. But you might want to take your pick and stick with it. Man Lake and Better Bees, theirs are 14 inches. Everybody else's are 13 3/4. Don't know why. Somehow the standard in the southeast was one thing, and the standard everywhere else kind of became something else. But if you set a 13 3/4 on top of a 13 on top of a 14, you just have a little 1/8 of an inch showing on each side. It's not that big a deal. It'll work. So I cut that off, and then I cut around this to notch it into this frame rest here. So this is all the same pieces. I didn't buy any new wood to change that into a 8-frame instead of a 10-frame. This is a quote I liked from Richard Taylor. He says, I like everything about it, I guess. No man's back is unbreakable, and even beekeepers grow older. When full, a mere shallow super is heavy, weighing 40 pounds or more. Deep supers, when filled, are ponderous beyond practical limit. Keep in mind, you're still going to be using this equipment, unless you're not as addicted as the rest of us. You're still going to be using this equipment 40 years from now if you take care of it. So you might want to think in those terms. I meet these young guys who are like, well, I'll worry about that when I'm older. Well, yeah, but you'd be surprised how fast that happens. You think that's just going to be forever from now, but it's not. Natural cell or small cell comb. This saves me a lot of work in a lot of ways. Not only do I not have to buy treatments and put them in and pull them out and all of that, but I also get clean wax, and actually the benefits are so much I don't even know where to start. But let's assume that you go with narrow frames, which would be 1 1/4 inches instead of 1 3/8 inches, and you go with either small cell foundation or foundationless, and we end up with small cells. And let's say we've got small cells. Now we have more cells per square inch here than we would if they were large cells. Then, because they're closer together, the nurse bees can cover more brood. So the nurse bees can raise more brood because they can cover more brood, and they can raise more brood because there's more cells per square inch here. And then we shorten the gestation cycle from 21 days to 19 days by going to small cells. So the whole turnover of this brood is 2 days quicker. So you take some small cell bees on narrow frames in the spring, they can just explode. They can just grow so fast, it'll boggle your mind sometimes. So how do you get small cells? That's kind of a topic on its own I could talk about for about an hour, but we'll just do the quick version. I think the quickest, easiest, most foolproof way in recent times that I found is to buy the PF100s or the PF120s. But they seem to be changing them, so I don't know. I may have to buy some new ones and try them out and see what I've got. The ones I bought quite a few years ago, and they seem to have changed their mold now. So maybe I need to try this again. But I was having really good luck with the Man Lake PF120s because the bees would draw them the size they are, and with the wax 4.9, they wouldn't necessarily draw it the size it is because they can rework it. So part of the issue here is you take bees that have been artificially enlarged. I didn't sidetrack on that topic yet here, but I guess I should a little bit. Some guy named Bedeau came up with this wonderful idea. Well, Huber played with it a little bit just because he was curious, but Bedeau came up with this idea that if he could get the bees big enough, they could work red clover. And red clover is a huge nectar source in Europe. And Caucasian bees can sometimes just about reach red clover. In fact, if the conditions are just right, they can reach the nectar in red clover, but the conditions aren't always right. And the rest of the honeybees can very seldom reach the nectar in red clover. Their tongue isn't long enough, while the bumblebees can reach it just fine. So he's trying to make bigger bees so that they could reach the red clover. And he took foundation and stretched it, and he made the bees bigger and bigger and bigger. He got up at least to 5, 6 or so. Dee says he got all the way up to 5'8". I haven't seen all of his research. I've seen some of it, so that may be true. If she says so, it probably is. But he enlarged them to the point where they're almost as big as what a drone would be before he started doing this. But he had to do that gradually. Well, eventually our beekeeping industry here decided it was kind of a good idea, but rather than go as big as he did, which required all these incremental growths in order to get them to accept it, they went with a size that you could pretty much catch some bees out of a tree, put them in there, and they would build it, and it would work. So they ended up at 5.4 millimeters. Well, at 5.4 millimeters, you end up with a bee that's half again the size of a natural bee. And 150%. That's like, that's like comparing a 100-pound person to a 150-pound person. There's a significant difference. It's not trivial. It's not monstrous, but it's not trivial. It's a difference. So anyway, to get them back down, we now have this larger bee. It doesn't build a smaller cell necessarily because part of how it's measuring the cells is with its own body. And so you have this regression issue of trying to get them back to natural size. And the PF100s and 120s seem to do that really well because they draw it exactly the way it's laid out, and then the next generation of bees is smaller. Honey supercell is already drawn. If you're having trouble getting them to draw this out, you can buy this. It's expensive, it's heavy, and it's hard to get the bees to accept it. But if you don't give them any other choice and they use it, then you've got some small bees. And once they use it, they accept it pretty well. But it's just that initial getting them to use it, and of course that initial buying it, and then the boxes are heavier, but it does work. Another choice, I did this, I bought a bunch of permacone, which already, this comes in deeps, and I went in mediums, this comes in mediums. It's the same thing, basically, it's fully drawn. It's slightly bigger than this, it's probably about 5.0, rather than 4.9. So I wax dipped it, so I heated it in an oven to 200 degrees, dipped it in the wax, shook all the wax off, and I had perfect acceptance. They just treated it like drawn cone. And I got small cells because that coating of wax brought it down to 4.9. In fact, it probably brought it down to about 4.8. Brought it down to 4.9 if I didn't take into account that the cell was tapered. I didn't think about the cell being tapered until Honey Supercell came out, and we started arguing about the measurements, and eventually I accepted that they were smaller, because even though they were a little over 4.9 at the mouth, they were below 4.9 at the bottom. So they were about, 4.85 to 4.95 or something, I don't know. Anyway, so I wax dipped it. This worked really well, but it's a whole lot of work. And it's extremely messy, and I don't recommend it just because it's so much work. And permacone isn't cheap, and right now I think he's selling it in lots of 1,000, and most people don't want to buy 1,000. So. Foundationless frames are a little less foolproof, but if you put them on narrow frames, if you narrow the frame from 1 3/8 to 1 1/4, or from 35 millimeters to 32 millimeters, the bees tend to build smaller cells. So you'll have a lot better luck doing foundationless on narrow frames than you will on standard 1 3/8 inch frames. So that's my use narrow frames thing there.
Mike, you got questions?
Yeah.
Are narrow frames widely available?
No.
That's something you gotta make.
Right now you have to make them. I was hoping to have some available by now. I'm working with Shastina trying to get them to make some for me and make narrow foundationless frames. And they sent me a sample, and it wasn't quite what I wanted, and I sent it back, and they're supposed to send me another one, and I haven't seen another one. And now the rush is on to make bee equipment, so I don't know when they'll catch up. So.
And you just want those in your brood chamber area?
Or
would you use them throughout?
I like everything to be interchangeable, but yeah, it probably only really matters in the brood area, because actually in the honey, once they're drawn, I tend to space them out wider to get a little fatter, but I'd rather just have them all the same so that they're all interchangeable. Yeah.
In the feral, in the wild, 85 to 90% of all comb is worker size, period. And the smaller, the better, the faster it's laid in. Drone comb is only on the peripheries, and it's 10 to 15% maximum. And so when you do a hive, even if you go 5, 6, or 7 deep, you want 90% or more small cell comb. You don't want the drone stuff, because it's not that way in nature. If you were to do it, you mimic nature.
So I already talked about regression.
Mike?
Yeah.
So we successfully regressed 20 colonies last year on the PF120s, but we still ended up in running 10 frame deeps. We still ended up with a ton of thin and burr comb. So my question is, how do you measure the bee space with those plastic frames? Like, I'm sure, is there anything? You can't.
Yes, you can.
With the plastic ones?
Yes.
How do you correct the bee space on a plastic one?
You can run it through a table
I
saw.
run through a table saw.
Sander.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can use a
I
belt.
just run them through a table saw, take a 1/16 of an inch off each sidebar.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing about the Man Lake is the top bar is exactly 1 inch wide. So once you shave down the sidebars from 1 3/8 to 1 1/4, you have exactly a 1/4 inch bee space between the top bars, and then you don't get that wax filled up between the top bars.
And then is there space to put an 11th frame in? Because I have a gap.
Yes.
Yes, then you'll be able to get 11th frame in if you want to. You don't have to, you just leave extra space on the ends.
I'd put an 11th frame in.
I do sometimes, but
I run 9 in my 8-frame boxes all the time.
So is someone going to talk to Man Lake?
I've tried talking to all these guys. They don't want to hear it.
There's a lot of investment in the
Oh yeah, and the molds are expensive. Yes.
super expensive.
I get tempted to try to do this, but the problem is the beekeepers can't agree on what they want. So it'd be hard for me to You know, there's people who want just the foundation, they want to put it in the wooden frames. Well, that's nice. I can see the appeal. But to me, one of the appeals of the PF 120s is I don't have to put the frame together. I can just throw it in the hive. And that's awfully nice. So if I were to do a mold, do I do just, you know, that's a whole nother mold to do just the foundation, and another mold to do just the narrow frame with the small cell plastic on it. And then it would be tempting to do another one that's just a narrow frame that's foundationless, that's plastic. So you don't have to assemble the frame, but you don't have the foundation at all. But all of those are different. That's 3 different molds. and they cost like 10 grand a mold. So
More than that.
Yeah, they're a lot more than that.
I think the prices on some of that stuff's coming down, but it could be a lot more than that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
are the PF 100s and 120s and the Honey Super Salt, are they plastic?
Yes.
They're all plastic?
Yes. So if you don't want plastic, then you need to do wooden frames with cone guides and do foundationless, or use the 4-9 wax. You can get 4-9 wax from Dadant. And the problem is when you're trying to regress them, they often won't build the 4-9 wax right the first 2 or 3 tries. Sometimes they'll do it the first try, sometimes they won't do it till the second or third try.
That's been my experience.
Yeah, and that's the problem with the 4-9 wax.
Because I do use the 4-9 buttons.
Yeah. Eventually, you'll probably get there, but
But not always. So, yeah.
I can't argue that if you never got it there. I don't know. The permacomb and the Honey Supercell are pretty much instant. You put the bees on it, and that's all they have to work with, and then the next generation of bees is smaller.
Can you dip the Honey Supercell in wax?
The problem is now you're too small, but
Oh,
yeah, you probably could.
It's exactly 4-9.
It's pretty much exactly 4-9. Now, if you dipped it, you'd probably be around 4-8, and that's not unworkable. The bees would probably use it all right.
Permacomb is 5-4, and then when you dip it, it's...
Oh, no. It's 5-0.
Oh, okay.
It's not 5-4, no.
Okay.
It's about 5.0.
I've never heard of it.
So when I dip it, it's about 4.9.
Oh, okay. And then do you replace it? Do you pull that out so you can reuse it eventually? Or do you just
I
keep
never pull it out. I
in
just
rotation?
use it. I just use it. Once I got it in there, I don't see a good reason to pull it out. But if you hate plastic, then pull it out. But I don't mind.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
if you're doing swarm trapping and you catch a swarm, you're not going to know at that point. I mean, you're assuming they're feral bees, but there are other beekeepers in the area. So would you immediately...
If you're used to seeing regular size bees, it's obvious whether they're feral bees or not. Because they're 2/3 the size if they're really feral bees. And they're,
But then you have to go through all this and just go let them...
okay, you just put them on foundationless or,
So my question was, if you're swarm trapping, like how are you, what's the evaluation process if you're going to go immediately to these types of frames to get regression? Do you assume that because they're feral, they're already small enough? And
I don't think that you can assume that they're feral.
well, that's what I said.
if they're 2/3 the size of the rest of them, they're either feral or they're from somebody's small cell hives.
Well, you're either going to get a swarm of bees that are large, or swarm of bees that are small, or swarm of bees that are somewhere in between. You're just happy to get the swarm.
Right.
If they're big, you work to make them smaller. If they're small, you count your blessings.
I've bought packages that I just threw in on foundationless. In fact, I put them in a top bar hive and had them draw 4.7 right out of the box. That's not what I got when I had bees that I knew were on 5.4 that were my bees, and I put them on foundationless. They tended to draw about 5.1, 5.2. They didn't draw 4.6 or 4.7. So you don't know what the guy was raising them on. He might have had them on Peerco, which might be about 5.2. He might have had them on Man Lake. Didn't used to even advertise those as small cell. Those PF 100s and PF 120s were their cheap frames. I'm sure a bunch of commercial guys bought a crap load of them when they were under $1 a frame. I know I did because I knew they were small cell, but they used to be under $1 a frame. I mean, that was just dirt cheap back before plastic went up in cost. So I'm sure a bunch of them bought those and are using them and don't know it. You know, they just think they're plastic frames. They don't know that they're small cell. So I've had packages that actually drew small cell right out of the package, but I wouldn't count on that because odds are they're on 5.4 and odds are they're gonna fight you a little bit on the way down. But yes.
When you talk 5.4, you need to make sure everybody understands that 5.4, by the time the bees have to thin the cell walls, even on plastic, is the same size as drone with Bordeaux originally seen way back in the early 1900s, late 1800s. And that's why there's mite problems and pest problems, because drones are the ones that take the hit for the disease, keeping the workers healthy.
So back to the wax dipping permacomb or honey supercell. I won't tell you it's a bad idea. I'll just tell you it was a whole lot of work. It was extremely messy. I have clothes at home that are still totally covered in wax and boots that are totally covered in wax because shaking off the wax, it splatters. And so, you know, it is a pain. Was it worth doing? Yeah, I got instant regression at a time when everybody was still fighting to try to get them regressed. And I would probably do it again if I were under the same circumstances, but I'm not under the same circumstances because I can buy honey supercell. It's already that small. I just have to put up with 3 weeks of the bees kind of not wanting to use it, and then after that they use it all right, and I'd be past that. So I'd probably do the honey supercell before I'd do the wax dipping again because it was just too much work, and extremely messy. But so this is the PF 120. You can see how many that's measuring across 10 cells there. I'm going to skip that.
Why are you skipping that?
Go back.
He's got a lot of slides.
Because I got 90 minutes worth of stuff to get through is why. Otherwise, I got nothing. I'm not trying to hide anything from you. I just didn't want to get sidetracked.
So go to your website if you want to know about that.
Sure. And I think let's skip that. Let's go to... So back to labor-saving things. I think foundationless is a whole lot less work. I don't know how many of you have ever actually done wire and crimped it and wax and then embedded it, and you know, especially if you're putting in all the eyelets and all that stuff. I'll say this: some people love tedious, detailed work. If you like doing cross stitch, you may love wiring wax. I don't know. I don't. So I can't say that you won't love doing it. I don't know. Some people seem to love doing it. I hate it. It's just tedious work to me. But I think it saves me an awful lot of time and an awful lot of work. And I get clean wax. And I let the bees build whatever they want. And once I've got them regressed, whatever they want is fine with me. That's where I want them. I want them building what they want, not what I want. This is a foundationless frame. It's got a bevel right here. I'm hoping to have some like that in narrow frames one of these days and put them up for sale, but I don't have them right now. So right now you have to either buy, Walter T. Kelly has them that have a smaller bevel in the middle, so it's kind of like flat, then it has like a little tiny bevel right in the middle. And they work all right. They aren't narrow. You'd have to take a plane and plane them down if you want to make them narrow, and I'd recommend you do make them narrow.
You have to do the top bar too. Otherwise, the top bars will be too close together. Bees won't be able to go through.
I've done them and not done the top bars, and yes, they get a little more burr comb in there, but the bees always seem to get through anyway. What's that?
It does depend a little on the manufacturer. Some of the top bars are 1 1/8 inch wide and makes it pretty tight. Oh,
if it's 1 1/8, you might be in trouble. 1 1/16 is pretty typical, but the ones I'm hoping to sell will actually have the narrow top bar. It'll be just under an inch instead of an inch and a 1/16. It's actually 15/16, I think.
I've been making mine between an inch and 30 seconds, and that works great too.
So anyway, if you're going to make your own foundationless frames, I'd narrow them. The easiest way to narrow them depends on what you got for tools. She mentioned a sander. A sander works pretty well if you got a belt sander and you just kind of touch it and make yourself some kind of gauge. Take a 1x2 and nail a piece of 1x2 and a piece of 1x2 with exactly 1.25 inches in the middle. You can check it with your gauge and see if it fits. You can just hit it a little, check it, hit it a little, check it, and you're probably done with that end. Yeah.
You can buy, or at least you used to be able to buy the little hand planers
Yes.
that are only this big. You can put in your pocket.
Yes.
You just take to the field and just go right down the top of those envelopes.
And that's actually my favorite method is the little hand plane. If you get a little hand plane and you get it nice and sharp and you get it adjusted just right, you can get it where it takes about 2 swipes on each side and you're done. And that's really quick. You know, you just go swipe, 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 and then check it with your gauge and you're done. So that's my preferred method is the little hand plane. But you can do it on a table saw. You can do it a lot of ways. I will say this, we keep bringing up table saws. If you don't know how to use a table saw, go take a class at your community college on how to run a table saw safely. It's a very dangerous piece of equipment. Don't just go buy one and start messing with it, because it really is a dangerous piece of equipment. You can handle it safely, but there's a whole bunch of rules you need to learn, and you need to follow those rules if you're gonna not get hurt. And I've known guys who actually followed all the rules and who'd been doing it for decades and still managed to get hurt.
I got a picture.
Because that's how dangerous it is. So I just want to make sure you don't just go out and buy a table saw and start doing this. To tell you the truth, I think you're better off to buy a cheap little table saw anyway, because the big powerful ones will get you in more trouble quicker than the little weak ones. The little weak ones get in a bind, it just stops the motor. The big powerful ones get in a bind and it'll drive something right through you on a kickback. So anyway. So natural cell size, I already talked about that somewhat on how it affects the mites, but we can talk a little more about how it affects the mites. Let's talk about why small cell works. First of all, a varroa, a foundress mite goes in the cell, she hides in there, it gets capped, right? And then she lays an egg every 32 hours or so, and the first one's a male. It's haploid, has half a set of genes, just like a drone does. And then she lays a female every 32 hours or so after that. And only if this female makes it to maturity and gets mated to that male is it viable. So, in a normal 21-day cycle, in normal large cell foundation, that results in somewhere between 1 and 2 offspring. So basically it's 1.5 plus or minus 0.5 is what it averages out to. So it averages out to that. So sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 1 offspring. At 19 days, which is what you get on small cell, you end up somewhere between 0.5 and you end up somewhere between none and 1. So really it's down to 0.5 plus or minus 0.5 is what it averages out to. So you either get none or you get 1, but you never get 2. Now, that's just figuring on the time of the cycle. The other thing that happens on small cell, according to research by De Jong, is that sometimes that male gets trapped on the outside of the cocoon, and then it doesn't mate with the females, and if they don't mate, they're not viable. When the bee emerges, they just die. Yes, Steve?
You're saying 19-day cycle. That might be for the man-laden perms.
Oh, it can be 18, but
I've never seen 15 to 17.
I've never seen that. I've measured it and I get between 18 and 19.
4-7 times. It's called speeded up genetics, or it used to be. And there's no mite reproduction in it because there's no females laid.
Anyway, what I've seen and what I've measured is between 18 and 19. And what Zerzan and Huber measured was between 18 and 19. So, but that's 2 days, that's 2 to 3 days shorter than 21. So that makes a world of difference on the reproduction of the mites. And then you've got that male survivorship issue, that the male gets trapped on the outside of the cocoon and then he doesn't even get to mate with them. So then that knocks it down even lower. Yeah.
And why does that happen in small cells? Why does the male get trapped on the outside?
Nobody knows. De Jong just proved that they do. He didn't prove the mechanism as to how, but my guess is it's just, obviously the space is different. There's less space in here, so the larva is crowded in here tighter, and somehow just the way the space works out, he ends up getting trapped on the outside. I don't think anybody knows the exact mechanism as to how that happens, but I'm sure it has to do with that.
It's the size of the cell, only with first upsizing in 1904 with Nozema, were the first mites seen that were kept top secret and confidential in all files in this government where they looked at it because they didn't want it out. And it's a royal jelly composition change for the food that's eaten for fast food besides smaller emerges faster. And again, I'm saying 15 to 17 days and not 19. And Dijon wasn't quite small enough yet. The first regret was down where they were trying to go bigger down in his area, which is why he brought the smaller bees in.
Okay. One minute, second.
Michael, who is doing the research, did you say, on this?
Dijon was the one who did
Dijon?
the research on the male survivorship one. He also did another one on small cell. If you go to my website and go to small cell theories under my, there's a pest section. If you go under there, there's a small cell theories, and I've got a whole bunch of links to those research
Great.
papers.
Thanks.
If you want to go look at the papers.
If you have trouble getting any of them, I have them all too.
I was going to say one other thing that the other thing that is happening here is they're getting capped a day earlier. The fact that they're getting capped a day earlier means that less of them actually succeed in getting in there and hiding and getting capped. The Varroa go in there right before it gets capped, and they miss their window more often when it's getting capped a day earlier. But the other effect is the pseudo-drone effect. I would love to do some research to try to back this up, but this is Dee's theory, and I think it's true. I just haven't had the time to uncap a lot of brood and count mites, which would be the way to prove it. But on 5.4, you're talking, you now have cells that are the same size as Serrana drones. If you go look up Apis cerana, the cell size for the drones in Apis cerana is 5.4 millimeters, which is exactly the size of our standard foundation.
It's also the size that Bardot measured for honeybees in Europe for Apis mellifera per passion, and only naturally sized bees worldwide that he looked at.
For the drones?
I don't know about that, but I do know it's the natural size for Serrana. Serrana is the natural host of Varroa. That's
No, it is
where
not.
Varroa came from.
It's worldwide in confidential files in Spain and in all the U.S. files, all throughout the whole Mediterranean and worldwide, that they wanted confidential and secret because they didn't want the word out because they were setting up for money later.
Okay, so Varroa worker cells are down in the 4.3 range. They're actually, the worker cells in Serrana vary a bit in size, and the drones are very consistent, which is kind of backwards of Apis mellifera. In my experience, the drone sizes vary a lot, and the worker sizes stay more stable. But anyway, the theory is that the Varroa are mistaking the workers for drones because we have them in cells that are the size of the drones, and that you'll get a lot less infestation of the workers and a lot more infestation of the drones if you're on small cell, because now the drones are closer to the right size for a drone in Serrana, and the workers are down below what a drone would be in Serrana. And in Serrana, the Varroa only infest the drones. They don't infest the workers. Yeah.
I've got the paperwork that shows Apis cerana is the same size by latitude and altitude as all known original European races. So that's just BS per se. That's taught by our government here in the U.S. and the ones in England want kickbacks.
So how do you make foundationless frames? You can buy any standard frame and make it into a foundationless frame. This is not a standard frame. It's just something that kind of looks like a frame. Well, it's missing a few pieces, but and they're not quite the right proportions for a normal frame. But anyway.
It is too.
It is too a normal frame? Are you claiming this is a normal frame?
Proportions are perfect lines struck. Those are some of my frames that are just cut down for demonstration.
I know they're your
Line
frames.
structs, and it's for small scale bees.
Yes, but this is not a standard Hoffman frame. Wow, I got to argue with everybody here. Anyway, my point is, if you get a groove top bar, then it's like just a groove cut here. Then you can just put any kind of strip of wood in there for a guide. If you have what they call a wedge top, which should be called a cleat top, and you break the cleat out and turn it this way and just turn it 90 degrees, rotate it on its axis so that it sticks down and nail it back in, you'll get an edge that sticks down here, and that will work. If you buy chamfer molding, it's a 90 degree right triangle. It's an isosceles right triangle cut out of wood, and you can buy it at a real lumber yard, and you can cut it to fit and nail it on, and you'll have a little bevel. Or you can do like I did. I bought a bunch of frames from Walter T. Kelly and got them to not cut a groove in the top, and then I just cut a bevel on it myself. But all those ways will work fine. You could also put a starter strip of wax foundation in there, but I don't like to do that because then if the wax moths ever eat this up, I have to take it back to the house, scrape it all out, put another strip in, and wax it in. Yeah.
I've been cutting down plastic foundation so it's about a ½ inch wide, and just using a mallet to put it in to the top bar, so there's really only a ¼ inch of it.
That'll work. I just...
Now, does the cell size make a difference if it's that small? Or will it just act as a...
Probably not, but why mislead them? I just put a plain piece of wood in there, and then I don't mislead them. But then I'm sort of ambivalent on plastic in the sense that my world is full of plastic, and if plastic will help me get a job done that would be difficult to do otherwise, like the PF100s or the PF120s or the permacomb, then I'm willing to use it. But when a piece of wood would do just as well, I'm kind of iffy about putting plastic in when I could just cut a piece of wood.
You need to coat the wood with wax.
I never coat the wood with wax, no. I don't recommend it. I recommend you do not coat it in wax. Because if you coat it in wax, it's more likely to fall off. The bees work propolis and wax up into that wood, and they really stick it on good. I've dipped them in wax and then had a hot day, the wax has fallen off. Or a hot day, they started building comb, but the wax got hot and the whole thing fell off. But I've never had that happen when I leave it bare wood. Yeah.
The bees I'm working right now have been starting from the bottom up, and
Yes.
that's led to some problems because it's foundationless and their wax is actually falling over into the other frames.
Right.
So
Scrape it off and put the box on the bottom.
What was that?
Scrape it off and put the box on the bottom
Okay.
instead of the top. Because the natural direction bees work is down, not up. And the problem is you created this problem that you put a box on of these frames, and there's nothing but air between here and there. There's no ladder for them to get up here. There's no real incentive for them to get up here, and they don't want to leave the cluster because it's still kind of cold. So they're staying with the cluster, but they feel the need to build wax, so they start building it up. Huber went to great lengths to try to fool them into doing the same thing, and he succeeded so that he could watch them build the wax, because when they're hanging in a festoon, you can't see them build wax because the bees are all blocking your view. So he purposely got them to do that. But when you stick a box of empty foundationless frames on top of a box of the clusters down here, then they often do that, especially early in the spring. When it gets warmer, they're less likely to. But if you're going to put it on the top, always make sure you put a ladder in the middle. Get a drawn comb from the box below and put it right in the middle. Now they've got a ladder to get up to the top, and they're more likely to work it at the top. So,
Don't you want to put, just drawn comb, so you're not worried about moving brood up, you're just worried about taking comb up.
depends on the weather what I'm worried about. If the weather's warm, I might purposely put some brood up there because it'll get them up there. But if the weather's still chilly, I probably don't want to put brood up here. I probably want to grab a frame from the periphery over here and put it in the middle over here. But I want a drawn comb in there. But generally, if I was starting on a box of foundationless frames here with a package, I would add the next box to the bottom because it solves that problem. They just go on down. Now, once I got two boxes, then I always pull a drawn comb up into the next box when I add the next box, and pull a drawn comb up into the next box when I add a box, and so on. So they always have a ladder in the middle to get them up there. But in warm weather, the ladder works just fine. In cold weather, It works best just to add to the bottom. Also, it works best in the cold weather to add to the bottom because they always move to the top. And that's kind of where they want to be to stay warm. And now you just stuck an empty box up here. So now they got all this hot air, all their hot air is going up here. And if you add it to the bottom, you don't create that problem. So you're less likely to get chilled brood from adding that box if you put it on the bottom. Other issues with trying to do small cell is, and not treating is, it really helps if you can get some survivor stock from your location. Sometimes you have to set up a list of priorities of this would be the best, and this would be the next best, and this would be the next best, and do it in a, you know, from most effective to least effective. The least effective thing is probably to buy a package from California, but at least you have some bees and you have a queen and you can get started and they can start drawing comb and you can start heading down that road of having bees. But it's probably not likely that California or Georgia bees are going to survive the winter in a really cold climate, and they may not have any resistance to varroa at all. And they've been treated for everything, and so the microbes are all messed up because they've been treating them with terramycin and fumidil and whatever. So if you can start with survivor stock, that would be ideal. I mean, the ideal would be to catch a local swarm, and they're small. They're 2/3 of the size of the other bees, so you know they're actually feral bees. And you start with that, you've got a much better chance of success than anything else. So to do that, you probably want to set some bait hives out. Maybe somebody will talk about bait hives during the week here, and if not, you can come ask me. I'll tell you what I can tell you about it. But I could probably do a whole presentation on that. But that would be ideal. The other issues of trying to do this with no treatments is the sugar syrup is going to mess with the microbes. Pollen substitute, which they are so fond of trying to sell to beekeepers, I don't quite understand it, but pollen substitute makes short-lived bees. There's no time of the year I really want short-lived bees. I don't have any use for short-lived bees. If you want to feed pollen, which I think you're going to find is not usually that effective, but if you want to feed pollen, you need to trap your own pollen and keep it in the freezer, and then when you need to feed pollen, feed them real pollen. Don't feed them pollen substitute. Or you're just going to end up with a bunch of sickly, short-lived bees. I don't know what the point of that is, but people are buying them with their packages now, and there's almost always things blooming when you're putting the package in, and so there's fresh pollen out there. So you put this small hive beetle smorgasbord in here, and they just take right off. The small hive beetles do, not the bees, and I don't understand the point of that. I really don't. I think they're selling to a lot of hobbyists, and they're convincing them that this is your pet, and you have to feed them everything. But bees are not pets, they're foragers. They forage, that's what they do. You should let them. Now, if there's nothing for them to forage, you don't want to let them starve. So if you get a new package and you put them in and nothing's blooming out there, you're going to have to feed them to keep them from starving. But once there's a lot of things blooming out there, there's no reason to be feeding them unless you hit one of those times when it rains every day for a week, and then I'd be out there in the rain feeding them. But you don't need to feed them when there's plenty of nectar out there for them to work. And you don't need to be giving them pollen substitute when there's plenty of real pollen out there. I wouldn't be giving them pollen substitute ever. In the fall is about the only time I ever feed any pollen, not substitute, but real pollen. And that's just if there's a failed fall flow. If my fall flow fails, I need to make sure I have that last batch of young bees going into winter. And so if I see them gathering sawdust and coffee grounds in September, I figure I better do something, because if I don't, I'm not going to have any bees to get through the winter.
And you've got it in the freezer ready to go?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have to have already trapped it, otherwise it's too late to trap it when there's a pollen dearth. So yeah, I try to always have some pollen in the freezer. Yeah.
For somebody who's just starting off and doesn't have a supply of honey to feed their bees, what about adding a little vinegar to the...
I did not recommend feeding honey to your bees. I recommended not feeding them unless they're going to starve. Let them gather nectar. Feeding honey will just get them robbed. I don't think it's a good plan.
Okay.
I would try not to feed them. And I would never put vinegar in anything that you're feeding bees, because you'll just set off massive robbing and the only time I ever tried it, it was just a total robbing frenzy. It wasn't just robbing, it was a frenzy. And anything that adds smell, you don't want to put in feed that you're giving to bees, because you're just going to draw robbers. And that's one of the reasons I don't like feeding honey. Honey will just draw robbers.
Make your newt go out and forage.
Well, like I said, if there's nothing for them to forage, you're going to have to feed them. But if there's stuff for them to forage, yes, let them go out and forage. They'll do much better on natural nectar and natural pollen than they will on anything you're going to feed them.
So what do you feed them if they're starving?
What's
What
that?
do you feed them if they are starving?
If I have to feed them, I feed them syrup, but I try not to feed them. I try to manage them so I don't have to. And the more established you get, the more you have things to work with. You have other hives you can steal some honey from and just give them capped honey. Then I don't have to feed them. I give them capped honey, and then I don't set off a robbing frenzy. If I've got a weak colony, the last thing I want to do is put some honey in a feeder and then draw all the robbers to rob out this hive because they can smell the honey. They already have problems. I don't need to give them more problems. And anything you put that adds smell to syrup is a bad idea. Honeybee Healthy it's a bad idea on so many levels, but that's a whole other topic of microbes and whatever. But then you're adding all this smell that attracts all the robbers and often sets off a frenzy. So if you keep bees and you don't put any chemicals in there and you don't put any artificial feed on them, you're not feeding them syrup, you're not feeding them corn syrup, and then your homes aren't contaminated. And so basically honey is honey. You can harvest it from anywhere. You don't have to play the silly game of pretending that the magical queen excluder will keep all the poisons below it, and therefore I can't harvest anything below the excluder because it might have syrup in it or terramycin in it or fumidil, which causes birth defects in it. I don't have to worry about any of that because I didn't put any of that kind of stuff in there. If I never put any syrup in there, I don't have to worry where there's any syrup in my hive. If I didn't put any corn syrup in there, I don't have to worry about where there's any corn syrup in my hive. It's all honey. I can do whatever I need to do with it. And that actually saves me a lot of work, I think, not to mention not having to treat it. Leaving honey for winter is what I think is best for the bees. But more so than just being best for the bees, it's the laziest thing you can do. If you harvest all the honey and then you have to make syrup and then you have to feed all the syrup back, you've just created all kinds of new work for yourself. First of all, you had to harvest that extra honey, that was more work. Then you had to make the syrup, that was more work. Then you have to take it out and feed it. And then you have to deal with all the ants that you attracted by feeding it. And then you have to deal with all the robbing you set off because you were feeding it. And then you have to deal with the fact that you disrupted all the microbes and the bees aren't as healthy because you were feeding it. So if you leave them honey, you've saved yourself on all those fronts. Now, if that's not making you enough honey, then maybe you just need more hives. Rather than steal more honey and feed syrup back, maybe you just need more hives and you'll actually work less and get the same amount of honey. Yeah.
Can you leave too much honey out?
Only in the sense that it's a waste, yeah.
I mean, let's say you want to get up to 3 deep, and you're at 2, you throw another box on, they fill it, you decide to leave it for winter, then they fill the second deep, backfill it, force all the bees into the bottom super before they go into winter. Would that be too much?
I'd steal the top box because it's all going to be crystallized in the
It's
spring.
going to be different in different climates. Like where I am, that would be too much space. It would have so much condensation that it would be a mold trap. And it would provide more challenges to the bees than benefit, more than 3 deeps. in my experience.
Yeah, to me, it's more a question of that it's all going to be crystallized come spring, and there's no easy way to harvest it. If you're in his climate, it's not only going to be crystallized, it's going to be moldy and crystallized. So I'd just soon harvest it as to have it left over come spring. But I really would like to leave them enough for them to build up on in the spring, which for an Italian-sized cluster in my climate is probably more than 2 deeps. It's probably 2 deeps in a shallow or 2 deeps in a medium or something is about what that would take. But I don't have any clusters like that anymore. I keep raising feral bees and the clusters keep getting littler. And, they don't eat that much, so I probably don't need that much.
Michael,
Yeah.
I'm still new and I'm learning you know, what the bees want and everything. My first year, I lost a lot of bees over the winter because they were late cutouts, and obviously they didn't have much. Being somebody that does a lot of removals, what would your strategy be to provide, especially for those fall removals, late summer removals?
Dry sugar is a way to keep them from starving, but it's obviously you can steal frames of honey from your other hives and give them. That's ideal. That would be my.
So just leave the other hives heavier to have a resource.
Sure. Yeah. I'm gonna steal some capped honey from them. That's ideal. I'm always for ideal if I can pull it off. And I think if you've got other hives, you should be able to plan for it and accomplish it. Yeah.
I stockpile capped frames of honey last growing season to give them during the winter. And I've done that, and my question is, once spring comes, assuming they haven't used all that, which they won't have, if I were to want to extract that or distinguish that between fresher honey that I did want to extract, how would I tell? Can you tell from the outside whether capped honey is crystallizing or not?
Often you can look at it and see it's got a different texture in there, but you can always uncap a cell and it's really understand. But come spring, you can always uncap some of that on the strong hives, and they'll just burn it right up. Or just put it near the brood nest. They'll tend to burn it all up in the brood, and then you don't have to worry about it later because they'll burn up all that crystallized honey. If it's the closest thing to the brood nest, they'll burn it up in the brood early in the spring in that build-up period.
It's easier for the bees to process the granulated honey than you, so you might as well just keep it for another year to feed.
Yeah.
And then extract more of your fresh stuff.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, how to do that.
That's why I don't like to leave them too much honey, is because it's all crystallized. You know, again, this is locality dependent. There's, if you live in a Tupelo area, maybe it's not all crystallized. Some people tell me theirs isn't crystallized still in the spring, and so they harvest in the spring. Where I live, that would never work. It's all crystallized. I can't get it to extract when it's all crystallized. I can get some of it out, but at least a third of it's still stuck in the cells, no matter how much I warm up the room and no matter how fast I spin it and no matter how much I work at it. Yeah.
That was my question, is what if you keep it up to 95?
Oh, that helps, yes. You'll get more of it out, but still it comes out half crystallized and it's still like a third of it's still stuck in the cells and doesn't come out. I don't know, in my experience, but maybe there's tricks I don't know that would get more out, but I don't know them, so I can't tell you what they are. The issue of honey and syrup is Martha Gilliam did the research that basically even just changes in nectar would change the biome of what was living in the gut of the bee somewhat. And if you feed them sugar syrup, it'll actually kill off what's in there. And then there have been 2 or 3 research projects since her research on that initially that have come to that same conclusion, that the sugar disrupts what's living in the gut of the bee. One of those specifically said that bees fed on honey will live longer than bees fed on sugar syrup. Now this is measuring the longevity of the worker themselves, and it had to do with their gut. That basically if you mess with the bacteria in their gut, then their gut doesn't have this film that protects it, and it destroys that protection for their gut. So we know that sugar syrup messes with that, and that it makes shorter-lived bees. Now, there's been some weird stuff on the Bee Informed survey that I don't know what to make of, talking about feeding honey and feeding syrup that I don't have a context because their categories are a little too broad. But these people were just looking at the health of the gut of the bee and the longevity of the workers that were fed sugar syrup versus honey, said the ones fed honey lived longer. Carts. This one's from Brushy Mountain. I put this rack on there so I can stack the boxes up higher and not have them all rattling off. It works kind of like a wheelbarrow. This has a hinge. You hinge it open, you back up on the hides. You have to wiggle them a little to get this angle iron under it. And then this strap holds the handles together because you move this handle closed to hold it. And then you put the strap on, you can wheel it off like a wheelbarrow. It's pretty handy.
How do you do one of those if you're not a welder?
I'm sorry, what?
How can you make one of those if you're not a welder?
I don't have a welder, and I didn't make this. I bought it from Brushy Mountain.
But you said you put that thing.
Oh, I went to a welder and had him weld this on. I didn't weld it on. I just had him weld it on. I just went to the local welder and told him what I wanted, and he just cut a few pieces and welded them on there. Yeah.
5 more minutes, it'll be 10:30 break time.
Okay.
Just so you're aware.
Okay.
And then Solomon takes over.
One of the things I started doing was leaving the burr between the boxes. Anytime you use any kind of plastic frames, you're going to get burr between the boxes because of the thickness of the top bar. I won't go into all that, but if you want more history, I'd be happy to give it to you. The reason that wooden frames have thick top bars isn't because it takes that much wood to support the honey. It's because they discovered when they made a thick top bar, they wouldn't build the burr comb between the boxes. Well, all those plastic ones have almost no top bar, and they always get burr between the boxes. So anyway, if you have burr between the boxes, I just pry them apart, work them, and put them back together. I don't try to scrape it all off. I think it's a waste of time. Burr comb and propolis, by all means, if it's in your way, get it out of your way. But otherwise, who cares? The bees are just going to rebuild it as soon as you close the box up. So you're just making more work for them. And besides, the propolis actually keeps them healthier. Marla Spivak's work on that says that the more propolis there is, the healthier the bees are. So unless it's in your way, leave it. If it's in your way, scrape it off. By the way, you'll see a top bar and it'll have these little piles of propolis on it. You know what that is? That's the depot. They're trying to do stuff with this propolis, and the propolis gatherers come in and they put it in these piles. And then the bees that are doing the work with the propolis, they're either putting it in the corners of the cells here to reinforce the cells, or they're polishing things, or they're filling cracks. Well, they come up and they get it off these piles and then they go work. And then you come in as the beekeeper and scrape all that off because you hate propolis and it's in your, you just think it shouldn't be there. And then as soon as you close it up, those bees go up there and they go, what the heck, where did my propolis go? Those lazy bums, they're not keeping up. Where's my propolis? Yes.
If you've already jeopardized the gut of your bees by feeding them sugar water, will the next generations be born with a full, healthy?
It's an excellent question. I think if you don't go in there with some antibiotics, odds are they'll recover once they get back on natural nectar. I think though, if you feed antibiotics, I'm not sure they ever really recover, because the research on looking at bees that had never been treated, bees which are wild, bees that haven't been treated in the last 10 years, and bees that are being treated with antibiotics, there's a whole different biome in the ones that have never been treated compared to the ones that haven't been treated in 10 years. So in 10 years, they didn't recover back to where they were once the antibiotics wiped them all out. But I don't think the sugar syrup's going to wipe them all out so much as it's going to wipe them out enough to cause problems, but then they might bounce back. I don't know if they'll totally bounce back. I can't say. I don't think there's enough research out there to answer that question. But
And of course, the quality of the sugar is a big thing. I've heard a lot of negative things about beet sugar, where there are other alternatives to it.
I used to always use beet sugar, and I was pretty happy with it. But several things have changed since I last fed any sugar. So, because now they first of all, it's GMO, and second of all, they're treating the seeds with neonics. So I think we really ought to worry more about how that affects us. But maybe we ought to be concerned about our bees too. But yeah, I'm not sure I'd use beet sugar now. As far as I know right now, they still don't have any GMO cane sugar. I'm sure they will shortly. But, and I don't think they're treating it with neonics, but it's hard to say.
Okay, you only got about 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay.
And then you take a break to start.
You don't have to take a break.
We'll invite you back.
What?
We
Why
like
do
it.
you cut out queen cell or swarm cells?
Well, here's one that'll save you a lot of time, I think. You'd be surprised how many times you think you have to find a queen and you really don't. For instance, you're doing a split. Well, if I see a queen, it's nice to know where she is, but I don't have time to find the queen every time I do a split. I don't. She's in there somewhere. I don't care. They'll work it out. There's an awful lot of things where you can either assume there's a queen in there, or you can assume you can handle it anyway. If you wanted to requeen a hive and they're kind of failing, you can give them a queen cell without finding a queen. If you're raising your own queens, you just put a queen cell in there. It'll go off as a supersedure, and you've requeened them without even having to find the queen. You can't do that if you don't have a queen cell. You can't just introduce a laying queen when that queen's failing without finding the old queen. But you'll find there's an awful lot of situations where you can just say, it'd be nice to find the queen, but I don't have time to do that. There's an awful lot of things where ideally they tell you should wait. So you go out to an out yard and you want to requeen this queen, and it's a 60-mile drive, and you get out there and they tell you, here's what Mary and Ellis would tell you. And he's right if you're a backyard beekeeper and if you really value this queen a lot. Basically, if you take the queen, put her in there for about 4 days with all the corks still in there, and let them get used to her, and then come back and pull the cork out on the candy side and then put it back in there, and then come back in about 4 days and see if she's been released, and then come back in about a week or two and see if she's laying. That's what he'd recommend. Well, if I'm in an out yard and I'm requeening this hive, I'm going to, I left out, find the queen, remove her, wait 12 hours, like overnight probably, and then start that whole process. Well, if I'm in an out yard, I'm going to find the queen, dispose of her, I'm going to wait 2 hours, I'm going to put a queen cage in there with the cork out on the candy, and I'm going to come back next year because I'm done. I'm not making more trips. So there's an awful lot of times you really don't have to wait 12 hours. You might have to wait 2 hours just to make sure they know they're queenless. But I can just take a break, eat my lunch, work the other hives, and by then the 2 hours are up. So there are a lot of times you don't really have to wait till the next day. When I set up mating nukes, I just set up the mating nuke, put the queen cell in it. I don't let them sit overnight before I put the queen cell in the next day. I don't think it makes enough difference to be worth the wait. It doesn't really improve the odds that much. This is me feeding dry sugar. We talked about that. Talking about how it can be a hive through when you just don't have enough food. This is a sheet of newspaper on the top bars, and that's just, I put a layer of sugar, clump it up a little, put another layer, clump it up a little. The nice thing about this is they really just eat it when they need food rather than they're stocking it all away as stores, which then...
That's what I did this year because it was my first year and I wasn't quite sure. I didn't have a sense of whether they had enough stored honey, and I used actually like a manila folder and put it on there. But I noticed, because I have screen boards and solid bottom boards, and I'm just to check underneath, just to observe. And I've noticed now that I'm seeing tiny bits of shredded paper that they're chewing the paper out and taking it out.
Right, that's what they do.
Yeah.
They'll chew through the paper to get to the sugar. And that's what I want them
No,
to
I didn't do newspaper. I actually left it open
It doesn't matter.
as your picture shows.
It's paper.
So.
They're going to chew it out.
Yeah,
and
they're
pull
coming.
it
I
off.
think they did take some of
In
the
fact,
sugar.
if you just put the manila folder in there and didn't put any sugar in, they chew it
They
up.
would take it out, yeah.
So, yeah, they're not going to leave it in there. I do a lot of splitting by the box. If I've got four 8-frame mediums full of bees, top to bottom, I might have some supers on besides that, but I got 4 boxes full of bees. I can put a bottom board and a bottom board, one for you, one for you, one for you, one for you, just deal them like cards, put a couple of supers on and put the lids on, and I can move to the next hive and do the same thing, and I can split a whole yard in about an hour. Just now, I always look at the bottom of the boxes to see if there's swarm cells on the bottom and see if they're emerged. If I see swarm cells, that's actually great. If they look though like they've emerged, now I've got to make sure that both of these have some open brood so they can raise a queen if they need one, because I don't know where the virgin ended up when I split them. And the other side probably doesn't have a larva the right age to raise a queen. So if I can find a couple of frames of open brood from another hive and give each of those halves a frame of open brood, then I know they got the means to make a queen and I can walk away from them. But so I always look on the bottom as I'm doing this, but I never pull a frame out. I just look on the bottom for queen cells. Yeah.
So I know we're running out of time. That was kind of my question, that how often during a year do you actually like really break down a hive and like go through, if
If I was doing what I want to do, probably 4 or 5 times a year. But, you know, I went to Afghanistan for 3 years and opened them all once when salt came out to help me when I was on R&R. So, ideally, 4 or 5. What do I get done in my out yards right now? Probably one time a year that I even get into them. I would like to get into them a lot more. I just haven't had the time.
And when you say get into them, removing
Open
frames,
them. Well, open them, remove frames, even look at them, even walk outside,
Right.
even set my eyes on them and say, yep, they're still there. That's about once a year right now on my out yards, and that's not good. That's not really what I want to do. It's just haven't had time. So, but 4 or 5 would be what ideally I'd like to go through them in the spring. I'd like to do one check to make sure they're not going to swarm on me, and maybe split them if they are, and then one check to throw all the supers on and make sure they're doing well, and throw the supers on. And if somebody's not doing well, figure out what I'm going to do with that, and then come back and harvest the honey, and then probably come back and check them in the fall, make sure they got enough weight, make sure if I need to give them some more food. Now, I actually do that sometimes, just heft the back of the hive to see if they've got enough weight. And if they don't have enough weight, then I look into it a little further and decide what I'm going to do to make sure they have enough food to eat. But that's probably ideally that's what I'd like to do. Now, if you're a new beekeeper and you're trying to learn, though, you're not going to learn anything only opening it 3 or 4 times a year. You need to open it more often. And I'd recommend, if you're a new beekeeper, every time you go to your hives, before you open the hive, pay attention to what's going on at the entrance. Who's coming and going, workers coming and going, how much traffic, whatever. Make some notes, and then write down what you think you're going to find when you open that hive up. And then open the hive up and see if you're right. And if you keep going through that mental process, you'll eventually get good at guessing what's going on in that hive. But if you don't think it through ahead of time and write down what you think is going on, then you won't get the feedback for that process so that you get better at it. But after a while, you get where you look at it, you go, that hive's about to swarm. I bet there's a bunch of swarm cells in there. Why? Can't even put your finger on it, maybe, but you've developed the sense of it, that just the way they're acting is they're so active and they're so strong, and the size of the box and whatever, you go, yeah, they're about to swarm. And you'll get that knack after a few years if you do that feedback, you know. But you gotta think it through, make your notes, make your prediction, and then get your feedback and find out if you're right. Another thing I'd recommend as a new beekeeper is start tracking when things bloom. Somebody said, I think he said that yesterday, but I totally agree, and keep them separated by year so you can see that last year this bloomed here and this bloomed here and the main flow hit here, and then you can start predicting, well, this bloomed 2 weeks early, and last time anything was running a week early, then the flow was only 3 days early. But if it's 2 weeks early, maybe the flow is going to be a week early. You start getting an idea of when to expect what. You know, you can kind of figure out what to expect. Because knowing when the flow is going to hit allows you to manage your bees better. You can make better decisions on, the flow is going to be in 2 weeks, I need to do this so that I'm ready for that. And if you don't know when that's coming, then it catches you by surprise, and the next thing you know, your bees have already swarmed or whatever. Also, every time you have a swarm, keep track of when that happened, and keep track of when things bloomed and then when they swarmed. And that way, you know, when this blooms 3 weeks early, I better watch them. They may swarm really early, and I need to be paying attention. So again, it's that kind of not only keeping notes, but getting that feedback of try and predict that. So this bloomed 3 weeks early, so I'm going to predict when I think the main flow is going to be, and then see if I'm right. You know, because just because this is 3 weeks early doesn't mean the flow will be 3 weeks early. This might be 3 weeks early and the flow might be a week and a half early. Because sometimes things catch up through the year, you know, or they get off more sometimes. But so anyway, that was that, and we're out of time.